Kids. Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to share with you some of my personal lived experience as well as some of my things that I've learned through my professional experience. And so a lot of this will be framed from the three affiliated tribes where I'm enrolled and where I work. So the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, which is on the Fort Berthold Reservation in central North Dakota. And then, as was mentioned, I'm also Assiniboine and Dakota. And so some of what I'll also be sharing is applicable to those tribes. And so I grew up on my reservation, and in the background of my first slide, you see a picture of my grandmother. And so as the oldest granddaughter, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and heard her stories about life before, you know, when she was a young person. So among the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people, we gardened, and in these photographs, you see a lot of squash. So she's cutting squash with a buffalo shoulder blade in the upper left-hand corner. And then in the bottom center, you see all of these slices of squash. And then in the top right-hand corner, she's hanging them up to dry. And we have three tribes and approximately three different varieties of squash. One of the varieties of squash is very, very hard, the exterior, and so I cannot imagine cutting it with a shoulder blade knife. The Mandan squash is so hard today that we have a hard time cutting it even with a regular knife, or sometimes we've even resorted to using power tools to open the shell of the squash. So, and to think of how industrious you'd have to be able to grow all of that squash and then to process all of that squash. In these photographs, you see some other examples of tools we used in gardening, as well as food preservation and food storage. In the upper left-hand screen, you see her holding a hoe that she would have used in her gardens. In the bottom left-hand picture, you see her gardening, and she has a traditional rake. In the top center, one of the foods that is used across tribes in the Great Plains and is a foraged food is a wild turnip. And so you see a braid, and I'm guessing there's hundreds of turnips there. And if you've ever, you have to know how to identify the plant and what kind of range where you would find that particular plant. Typically, those plants are spaced, I would say, on average, at least 5 to 6 feet apart. Sometimes it's a lot further apart than that. So when you're going to gather that many turnips, you either have a lot of family members with you helping to gather those turnips, or you're just really fast. We traditionally would use a digging stick, so not very big around, maybe a 2-inch diameter. Today, a lot of people will use shovels to gather those, so there's more disruption to the soil. In the bottom right-hand picture, you see an example of a traditional cache. And so in that cache, we would store our dried corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, watermelon, well, not the watermelon, but the seed. So the corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers would be both the dried produce, so the flesh of the squash that's been dried, possibly turnips, but then also the seed for the next year. So that's an example of both how we would preserve our food as well as store our seed for gardening. Here I'm going to share some maps of our traditional trade routes. Because we grew so much corn, and because of our location to the Knife River, so where Knife River Flint is available. You see the Mandan Hidatsa Trade Center, you see the Arikara Trade Center, and then you think about all of the other tribes currently located in this region. So we have our Turtle Mountain Reservation, our Spirit Lake, our Standing Rock, Sisseton Wahpeton, and then as mentioned over this direction would be the Fort Peck Sioux and Assiniboine. So there's a lot of trade coming in and out of this area. And a big part of that was because of our food systems. So our corn would be going out, but then other foods would be coming in to our communities. So here's another example of trade routes. So this would have been around 1775 is this map. So some of the similar direction you see trade coming in and out of Canada, and then of course coming from the south. Here's another map. This is estimated around 1800. Again, very similar. A lot of trade coming in from Canada and then from the southeast, and then some to the west. So that's the trade routes. And I mentioned having our gardens, but also bison and other wild game was an important traditional food, one of those ancestral foods for us. And we look at this map. So we have the range of ancient bison, and then eventually the bison were impacted by colonization, just like our tribes were. And so you see their range has been significantly impacted. And then this is a map from 2003, so a very drastic reduction in their traditional range. So you think about having access. So part of that was our traditional trade routes, and then part of it is our wild game. And when colonization happened, we ended up not just our wild game, but our people also had restrictions of our range. So here's a map, and as I mentioned, this is from my perspective of a person from the 3 affiliated tribes. So this is the blue color is land that my people had access to in 1885. That was reduced in 1870, another reduction in 1880, and so it kind of mirrors that reduction of our range or our land base as the bison. And then in 1891 is where we have our current reservation size. So definitely a reduction in our mobility as well as land that we were able to utilize. Another factor in our access to land was the construction of the Garrison Dam. So this light blue is the original Missouri River, and then the dam, was below us. So all of these red dots are communities that existed and eventually were flooded because of the creation of the what is called Lake Tsakakawea, but is the Tsakakawea Reservoir. And so everybody had to be relocated. It was over 90% of the population on the reservation. So that's not just tribal members, but non-tribal members as well. And my grandmother, so who was on the first slide, grew up down in Alba Woods. And when she talked about Alba Woods, because it was along the river bottoms, there was a lot of trees. She would talk about how many different berries there were. It was just lush with berries. The gardens were very prosperous because the soil was so rich being on the floodplain. And then our people had to be relocated up onto higher ground. And so the soil was much different. We lost a lot of timber, access to a lot of those different berries. And um, when growing up, when I would hear her talk as well as other elders talk, they would talk about the life in the river bottom very fondly, and most often would also talk about our foods that were available at that time and how close our communities were. So being able to just walk and go visit each other, how people would very much barter and trade in addition to the regular market system or regular commerce, but it was very close knit. And that changed. So when the reservoir was created and people had to move, that divided up our reservation into different segments. And so, for example, where my namesake, Ruth Packnell, was residing was in the Twin Buttes community. Where I reside is in the Newtown community, and that's where my grandmother Frances lived. It takes about 2 hours now to drive from that community to the other community. They used to be able to just travel across the water, but are unable to do that now. This photograph is some examples of some varieties of our traditional beans. So you see some black beans, some red beans, our sunflowers, some of our corn. I included the corn silk and then some of the dried squash. So these are ones that we would have cultivated. And we had and still have, but don't grow at the same rate, a number of varieties of corn. So almost 20 different varieties of corn. One of our important traditional foods, and I know this is a food that also is common across tribes in our region, is corn balls. There will be some variation with the specific ingredients, but it would be taking dried corn, parching it, and then so here on the bottom right-hand side, you see some dried corn, and in that same image you see corn that has been parched, and so you can see how it's a little bit brown. And then up in the top left-hand corner you see that corn that's been ground up, and it's very, very fragrant. So when I'm making corn balls and I'm parching my corn, you walk in and it's just this beautiful, beautiful fragrance of a rich corn smell. And then we would add berries. The preferred berry is June berries, or also known as Saskatoon berries, service berries, Sabbath berries. It has a lot of other common names. So that's the preferred berry that I was taught to use. Sometimes people will also use dried choke cherries that have been ground up. And then after that is incorporated in. One of the things about our current palate is that we like sweet. And so now people will add sugar. So this would be where you're incorporating both on the bottom left-hand side, the berries, the corn, and then some sugar. In the center, the berries have been very well incorporated as well as the sugar. And this is where you would add fat. So you would render fat probably from bison. So if you're not familiar with rendering fat, you would take the fat and then apply heat so that it liquefies. You would separate out any chunks, and then you would have that tallow. One of the fats that is used a lot in foods is also kidney fat. So the organ meat, organ fat. So then you mix in the fat here and shape it into your corn ball. Now, on my reservation, I have seen corn balls this color. I've seen them darker. I've seen some people whose corn balls are almost this color of the corn, very light. But I know for my preference and the way that I was taught, we like a lot of flavor of the berries in our corn balls. And some people will make them, they're about this size, so not very large, maybe 3 inches by 1 inch, and then about an inch in diameter. Some people will also make them into a ball, so like about the size of a something smaller than a baseball, but I've also seen them really big. So I've seen them as big as a softball, and I think there's even ones that are larger than that. One of the things that I also want to point out about this food is that it's a treat. So it's kind of a delicacy. People like to eat it because it tastes good. Maybe some of it's nostalgia, but it's also important to our ceremonies. And so when we have ceremony, there are certain foods that we need to bring. And for the Hiradza, Arikara, and Mandan people, at least, this is one of the foods that is commonly brought to our ceremonies. And another thing that I wanted to point out is I mentioned the flooding of our bottomlands and the change in access to land because of the dam. That has impacted people's access to Juneberries. So with the flooding, we have less Juneberries, and then also with the Allotment Act, which privatized our land base, that also changed people's access to land and being able to go out and harvest Juneberries as well as other berries. So choke cherries, wild plums, bullberries, and then, as I mentioned, the wild turnips. Some of the other important foods include wild mint, peppermint, wild onions. So one of the things that we'll do then, if we don't have the Juneberries, is a practice that is something my grandmothers talk about, is you do the best that you can with what you have. So if we don't have Juneberries, we will use an alternative. So the preferred alternative is blueberries. And then I mentioned the rendered fat, the tallow or the kidney fat that was traditionally used. I know that today not a lot of people will either know how or will use tallow, like they don't know how to render their fat, or they don't know where to harvest fat or purchase fat to be able to render it down into tallow. And some of our butchers do have kidney fat, or you can request kidney fat. We used to have a higher number of people who were ranchers, and so it was easier to have access to beef and beef fat if you butchered yourself. And we used to have more people who hunted, so having that access to wild game to be able to harvest fat from the wild game. So that's also having those whole foods, I guess, or those ancestral foods. I know some people will, if they don't have access to those, will use for their fat lard or Crisco shortening, as I've tried to think about ways to have a greater accessibility to corn balls. One of the substitutions I've made for vegans is I've used coconut oil, so it has a little bit of a similar consistency to some of the other fats that we use that are animal based. And it gives it a little bit of a different flavor, but it does um, still kind of hold its shape. Another thing that I've experimented with our corn balls is I've used, instead of white sugar, so the refined sugar, I have used maple sugar. So maple sugar is something that we may have traded for in the past and that we can also either trade for now, or we can purchase from other tribal nations who do have access to a lot of maples and have either maple syrup or maple sugar. And that was really tasty. Another alternative I did was, one of the things my grandmother would do is she would save her bacon grease, and she would have a container of bacon grease on her stovetop. And I know a lot of people, as I was growing up, really enjoyed the flavor of adding bacon grease to their cooking. So I've made corn balls using the bacon grease, and that was super tasty. I think it would be interesting to look at the commercially purchased bacon versus if you cure your bacon yourself, so you know exactly what you're putting into your bacon, and instead of relying on, the different nitrates that might be in the processed bacon that you would purchase from your grocery store. Here is some pemmican that I made. And so pemmican is another traditional food that I would say has a broad range of tribes that have eaten it or that do eat it. And I know definitely across the Great Plains, but I believe, a lot of other tribes in other regions also have some form of pemmican. The way I was taught to make pemmican is to dry meat. So you would slice it up thinly and air dry it, and then you would put it, the way I was taught, in those slices into the oven to crisp them up a little bit more. You would add a little bit of that fat, so that tallow or whatever other kind of animal fat, and then you would add in berries. And so the preferred berry that I was taught, again, would be the June berries. And then again, as I mentioned, our palates have changed over time, and so people like them to be sweet. So they would, now we add in sugar, but we could, if we didn't want to use the refined sugar, could add in either the maple sugar or the maple syrup. Another alternative would be, I know some people have added honey, and similarly with the corn balls, I know some people have used honey as an alternative sweetener. So I talked about the air drying, and so here's an example of some squash that I sliced, and then instead of, I was processing a lot of food um, about that time, and so instead of having my dehydrator getting over full with everything and running all the time, I utilized a stick in my vehicle because it's summertime and it was hot, and hung up my squash to dry in there, and it took maybe 2 days. And you think about how hot our vehicles get in the summertime. So, again, carrying on those traditions of our food preservation. And here's my niece. So one of my grandmothers taught me how to dry meat, and I was fortunate enough to be able to share that experience and that knowledge with my niece. And so there she is with her beautiful long fingernails, cutting up meat. And neither one of us are experts at it. So I know sometimes when you see people drying meat, their slices are super duper thin, and ours aren't super thin, but it still does serve its purpose, even if it's not paper thin, beautiful, even slices of meat. And we dried this meat in my house. So we used one of those expandable drying racks for drying our meat. Here is a photograph of some of our Juneberries that we harvested, and in addition to harvesting them, then you need to rinse them. So similar to the turnips, you need to be able to identify the Juneberry plant. You need to know when it's going to be in season. You need to know if you have access to that piece of land. I mentioned chokecherries. These are chokecherry patties. So this is ground up chokecherries. And again, I don't know if you can tell necessarily from this photograph, but these are on baking sheets on my dashboard of my vehicle in the summertime. So instead of using the dehydrator, being able to use a energy electric-free version of drying the chokecherry patties. Now here's some of the other foraged foods. Here's a close-up of wild turnips. Here is a close-up if you're not familiar with wild onions. They're very, very small in comparison to the onions you would purchase in a store. So maybe the size of the tip of my thumb, that's kind of a big onion. A lot of times, they're even smaller, like the size of my pinky. And if you're not familiar with wild onions, they are very, very, very pungent. So they're very strong, even though they're very small. And then our turnips, if you're not familiar with the turnips, they have a very mild flavor. And once you dry them, typically they're used in soups or stews. And then in the upper right-hand corner is some wild mint, and that's another food that I mentioned. So it's used in tea, but it's also used medicinally. So again, making sure that for all of these foraged foods, you have to have that specialized knowledge on plant identification, when they're going to be coming into season, when is the time you want to harvest them, and then also where do you find them? So there's a lot of specialized knowledge in being able to forage these foods, as well as making sure that you have access to the land where you're going to be harvesting. And then what is an ethical harvest? How do you make sure that you're harvesting ethically? So those are all examples of that specialized knowledge of being able to have our foraged foods. And oftentimes you'll see soups made with the wild turnips at our ceremonies or other community gatherings. At our ceremonies, you will also see wild mint tea at those same gatherings. And then, let's see here. So again, thinking about, access, our traditional trade routes. So when we had that reduction in our mobility, that also affected what foods we had access to, who we were able to share with. But now, one of the things that we've been doing is looking back to not just our own traditional foods, but the traditional foods of our sister tribes, our relatives in all of these other directions. And I mentioned having specialized knowledge. Some of that knowledge was in our different tribal communities lost because of things like, for my tribe specifically, smallpox really impacted us. We had a huge, drastic reduction in population in a very short amount of time. So that impacted our transition of knowledge about these foods, where to gather them, how to process them. Another factor about the knowledge systems tied to these foods was the boarding schools. So removing our children from our homes, from our families, and having them indoctrinated into a completely different food system and disconnecting them from the land and those traditional foods. So sometimes those have been factors that have eroded our knowledge base of our traditional foods and the relationships that we've had with them. But as I mentioned, one of the things that we've really embraced is reaching out to our sister tribes, to other tribal nations. In this photograph, on the top left-hand side, you see some maple sugar, and just below you see the sugar trough. So we've taken maple syrup and heated it to a high temperature. I don't remember the exact temperature, and then used a paddle and just pushed that back and forth until it crystallizes into the maple sugar. In this photograph on the right-hand side, you see two gentlemen, two Anishinaabe gentlemen, and we are in Michigan in this photograph. So they were just finishing building this sugar trough, and that's the sugar trough in the photograph on the left-hand side. So these gentlemen were gracious enough to travel all the way to my community and share their knowledge about corn, mortars, and pestles. So they would say butagan. And this is the corn mortar and the pestle that I made with Jerry and Howard. And so they also would mill their corn using these mortars and pestles. And so this is my older clan sister, Bernadine Youngbird, and she teaches our traditional gardening and foods class, as well as other classes in the tribal college where we both work. She also maintains our college's traditional garden. And in the center, you see some of our high school students who were learning how to grind corn using the traditional indigenous food technology. And they really got into it. But one of the things I love about this picture, in addition to the the excitement on their faces, is it represents that multiple knowledge and multiple generations sharing knowledge. And that's one of the things that is important as we start to repair our food systems. So in this photograph, you see some of us from Fort Berthold, as well as some of our relatives from the Pawnee, so down in Oklahoma, who were also working on bringing back their traditional crops, so their traditional corn, and sharing our experiences with growing the corn, processing the corn, how they rematriated corn. So again, that sharing of knowledge about our food systems with other tribes. And then the next slide is some of my colleagues from up in Canada, up in Minnesota, down in South Dakota. And again, that transfer, that sharing of knowledge about our foods, about our ceremonies associated with those foods. And as we think about, I mentioned in the previous slide, thinking about that importance of that transmission of the knowledge of our traditional foods, leaning on what our ancestors were able to share with us, but thinking also ahead of our young ones. So this is my grandmother holding my granddaughter. And when I would make traditional foods and I'd bring them over to her and she would visit, and that was one of the things. So I talked about the importance of our foods for our ceremonies. I talked about the way they would talk about our berries with fondness, with nostalgia. And that was how it was when I would bring food for my grandmother. She really enjoyed it. They would really enjoy when we would make soup with the kidney fat, the extra flavor. So if you haven't had kidney fat in soup, I recommend you at least try it one time because the texture, it's not a super strong flavor, but it adds this real silky texture to the broth. I would almost say similar to how sometimes if you use coconut milk in beverages, it adds a kind of a little bit of a silky texture to those beverages. So it um, for my grandmother, sharing those foods with her, it was important that I was feeding her, you know, her body because she also had taken care of me, but it was also feeding her memories, feeding her spirit that was an important part of sharing those traditional foods with her. And now, as the work that I've been doing, thinking about our food systems in our tribal communities, a lot of our traditional foods are very minimally processed, or they're whole foods versus what we have accessible to us today in the grocery stores. A lot of times are highly processed. And I mentioned we don't always know all of the ingredients that um, are in those. So it's important to be able to have access to those traditional foods and to be able to share those foods with our elders or learn how to uh, harvest, to produce. So if we're going to be gardening, if we're going to be going out and gathering them, having that knowledge of that plant identification and, thinking again about community, the importance of community. We have access to things like Zoom. We have access to instant messaging, text messaging, telephones, and we don't always, we can learn that way, we can share that way, but that means we don't always do things together in person. And so that takes apart some of that human relationship. So you're not necessarily sitting with your elders and grinding the corn. Maybe you're at home and you're just putting it in your food processor and zip, 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 and it's done. So you're not talking about the garden where you processed or where you grew the corn and when the corn was ready and your grandmother's corn that she grew and the gardens and looking at what weeds are coming in and if it was a wet year or not. And so as our food systems changed and as some of those aspects of our traditional food systems deteriorated, it wasn't just the nutrition. It did have an impact again on our spirituality, on our tribal identity, and then also on our relationships with each other and with our land, and then with those plant and animal relatives that make up our food systems.